everyone. Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. As always, we invite you to grab a cup of coffee, join the conversation that lasts as long as your cup of coffee, as we discuss topics that are urgent to mission-based organizations. Please introduce yourself, tell us where you're from in the chat. We've got some amazing viewers from all over the world who show up every single week with us, join the conversation, and chat with us in the dialogue. Our last episode focused on the importance of using data to create effective feedback loops. And then we moved through the importance of understanding program effectiveness and making continuous improvements using that data that is often right there in front of us. Today, we take a deeper dive into the use of nonprofit data to inform our fundraising and how a well-designed strategy can be effective in raising the funds that we need to support our organization's mission. We begin today by asking you, how do you know what funding opportunities are a good match for your organization? The use of data can help organizations decide what funding is right there in front of them. In this episode, we'll be joined by Renee Callender. Renee is the Executive Director of Promoting Conflict Resolution, Inc., to discuss how even a younger organization can best align itself to funders as a data-informed and results-driven organization. My name's Rebecca Tuttle. I'm the founder and creator of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good. We help schools, nonprofits, organizations, and businesses find, write, and secure grant funding, and we teach you how to do it. I'm joined today by my co-host, Peter Blakely of Blakely Consulting. Welcome, Peter. How are you this morning?
Good, thanks, Rebecca. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. I am Peter Blakely. I am the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting, and I help mission-based organizations measure and maximize their impact.
That's great. I want to introduce our next co-host, Cynthia Rojas. Good morning, Cynthia. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? And hi, Peter. How are you doing?
Good morning. Good.
I'm Cynthia Rojas, and I am the principal and founder of To Your Growth, which is a management consulting firm that specializes in organizational development, change management, and leadership development. Welcome, everyone.
Excellent. Now, this morning, we are joined by a very special guest. In fact, she's one of our loyal viewers, and she's been with us since our Coffee Time with Masterminds began 14 weeks ago. I want to welcome Renee Callender, Executive Director of Promoting Conflict Resolution, Inc. in Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome, Renee. In 2017, with a nonprofit mission of unifying the family through literacy and technology with the hopes of combating inner-city violence, Renee knows firsthand the impact of trauma on the family dynamics and how important it is to ensure that the family unit continues to strive together. Since 1985, Renee's worked with the Boston Police Department. In the last 23 years, she's worked as a detective in sexual violence, human trafficking, crimes against children, and most recently focusing on internet crimes against children on both the state and the federal level. Renee has taught various criminal justice courses at Roxbury Community College in Massachusetts, Criminal Training Council. She's very active in her community, enjoys reading and vacationing with her family. She presently holds a master's degree and is working towards her doctorate. PCRINC prides themselves in giving families in the communities of Boston the tools necessary to maintain a healthy, strong family unit. If the family unit is healthy and strong, then young people can learn how to resolve conflict in a nonviolent manner. Welcome, Renee. We're so grateful for your viewership and even glad that you're happy to be here with us today.
Thank you, and hello to you, Rebecca, and Peter, and Cynthia. And thank you for having me.
Welcome, Renee. I'll start off. Renee, let's begin to talk with what is the work that you do in the greater Boston area at PCR Inc.?
So right now, the work that we were doing is helping to bridge the gap of financial instability within the family. And so we had created a program called financial literacy, meeting you where you're at, which it helps people understand that regardless to how much money they make each week, it doesn't really matter. It's what do you do with the money that you have that impacts the development of the family. So we have begun doing that, and we've been introducing technology to a lot of people because a lot of families, especially adults, don't really understand technology, and especially with these new apps that these children are using, and they don't understand that technology is good and bad. It's the performance and how you utilize it. So that's a lot of what we've been doing.
Nice. Thank you.
Renee, what are some of the priority areas of your work that you would like to see funded?
Right now, it allowing us to assist families with online technology for their students, because in this time of COVID, just education is so unsure as to whether or not it's going to be in school or they're going to be online schooling. And a lot of parents, not understanding the technology, are not able to help their children. And we're finding that some of these children are falling behind, not engaging in the online curriculum that's being presented because they don't know how to, they don't fully understand it, and they have nobody to assist them in the home.
Yeah.
Grants such as this, it can be approached from 3 different levels of opportunity, depending on the infrastructure or configuration of the organization. A school grant could be funded at the local level by a private foundation. You might even seek state funding from your Department of Education, or even a federal grant to assist with your educational fundraising needs.
Yes, we're open to all of that, especially considering there is an urgency because of the uncertainty, and we absolutely do not want our young people left behind, especially when you in elementary school where the introduction of computer began, but the fundamental concept of it has not, I don't think, truly been developed because it's just such a new area for our educational institutions.
Yeah.
How do you know where to get started? What's the difference between a state or a federal or a private funder?
You know, that's a great question, Peta. I would say on one side, it's a level of complexity. Municipal, state, federal funding, that's all public dollars. So taxpayer dollars pay for those funds. And those applications tend to be more complex, more difficult in nature to write, a lot longer. You have a lot more attachments. However, there are private foundations which are, you know, through direct donation or private donation. If you had a cause that you cared about and you donated to that foundation, then they have more flexibility with how they use those dollars. But there are larger private foundations out there with the same level of complexity as the state and federal and municipal funds. Cynthia, Peta and I have been speaking a lot about mission chasing, going after opportunities or funding that otherwise doesn't really fit with the mission of the organization. How important is it for leaders to stay on mission?
That's a good question. And you were just talking about complexity, Rebecca. And, you know, the minute you start deviating from your mission or getting involved in mission creep, you begin to create a complexity in your organization that didn't need to be there, right? So one of the things that happens when you bring on a program that isn't exactly aligned with your mission is that you begin to pull resources to then learn and develop an infrastructure you probably weren't intending to do. And in pulling those resources from your core programming, what could happen is, in fact, your other core programming begins to suffer and the outcomes don't look the way they should have looked, and the resources and the energy isn't being put in there. I do want to say that usually mission creep is something that happens because of external factors, and it's usually irresistible and subtle. So this is a key point. And I think Peta has a great example of an organization that had mission creep, but you have to listen very carefully to the problem that it had because it can easily be missed, and these nuances are important. Peta, do you want to talk about your example?
Sure. I talked to an executive director who ran a program that involved kids playing soccer. For the outcomes that they were interested in are positive youth development outcomes. So it's about the young people building their sense of self-efficacy, working as a team, engaging with caring adults so that great things will happen in their futures. They ended up aligned with a program that had kids playing soccer, but that program was doing it to reduce childhood obesity. And it was about physical activity and fresh air and learning to enjoy fitness and things like that. And because they had soccer going on, they adopted this program, and it never fit, right? And it seems so obvious, like, oh, they're playing soccer, it'll be fine. And we know all of these good outcomes come from playing sports, so they should work together. But even though they had activity alignment, they didn't have theory of change alignment. And so and when I say theory of change, I mean, why are we doing this, right? What is our rationale here? And so that program was just always an outlier, and whatever they might have gained from the funding that went with it, they spent more than that as a staff talking about how to manage it, how to report on the outcomes, what to do with it. And by the time we had finished our conversation, he realized he needed to just shut it down or find a new home for it, because it was not a fit for their organization and how they worked.
One of the interesting parts about that case study is the fact that on the surface, it looks okay. It's about soccer, right?
It's like it's going to be so easy to fit it in. We've got the field, we've got the uniforms, but it never fit. It
but
never
I
worked.
can see how the staff then has to learn about managing weight for children, how to then maintain that. And so it's a whole new learning than soccer for youth development, which is about confidence and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that example. Thank you.
And we should talk about that theory on another show and go a little deeper into that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, we could do a show on mission creep, because I think it happens more than we think it does.
I think so.
And we could also incorporate mission abandonment, right? We've had to make so many changes. Well, we've had to make so many changes because of COVID and the pandemic that I wonder how organizations have shifted their mission. Not to abandon it in a bad way, but maybe shifted their mission and, corrupted into something else, not because they're trying to, put a square peg in a round hole, but that would be an interesting show. Talk about missions and go deeper in that.
I want to give Renee a minute to talk about the mission of promoting conflict resolution. How do you summarize your organization's mission?
Well, the mission of our organization is literacy and technology, and educating the community through those two dynamics. And so with us, with going toward now leading more toward educating parents with the use of technology and learning to operate and understand online learning, and being able to assist their children moving forward, we didn't have to leave our mission because it was already in there. Our core mission is technology, because that's the way of the world and that's the way that everybody's leaning. And so it's important for us to not only utilize it, but understand it. And a lot of times that's where people get lost, because they don't understand it. They're just utilizing it, i.e. cell phones. We all have cell phones. We all use them. We can text, we can do all of that good stuff. But when it comes to an actual laptop or desktop computer, we kind of fumble, because we don't truly understand what we're doing on the technology itself. So we've always had that component in our nonprofit, and that's always been part of our mission. And so with that, now we realize that we need to do this core piece on educating parents so that they can assist their children, when that piece was never really at the forefront of our mission. But now with it has to be, but we didn't venture too far away from what our mission as a whole, which is actually an excellent thing. The only piece now that is kind of complicated is where in the past we used other people's space And now there is this urgency for our own space because people are hesitant and people aren't sharing their space with the outside organizations anymore. Because again, COVID is something that we don't know and we don't truly understand. And so it's all work in progress for the world. And so now space is, I think, becoming more and more important when at first it wasn't that high on our list of things to do.
Yeah. Well, I applaud your ability to pivot given the times, because organizations are struggling in how to pivot. And it sounds like you were able to figure this out very quickly. Wait, there is a need. Now parents are leading the learning in their homes, and we have to help them understand the technology that needs to get used. So good for you, Renee. We talk about pivoting all the time, and it's not easy. And it sounds like you did a really quick and great job at it.
It also speaks to how tuned into the use of data, the use of conversation and engagement with the people that you serve in your organization, Renee, because how would you know? Well, let me ask you, how did you know to make those changes, to incorporate those activities, to recognize that those were challenges and barriers to the folks that you serve? How did you know that?
Like you said, by speaking with people and understanding the difficulties of being at home and you're trying to navigate your own life through, because some people were fortunate enough to be able to work from home. Other people were just laid off with no income and what have you, but they still need to make sure that their children were getting what they needed. And for various reasons, whether it was a language barrier, whether it was just a total unknown waters of technology, that these people were having such a difficult time. And so like they couldn't get on Zoom. They didn't know how to sign in to do online classrooms. They didn't know the platform that the school was using. They were unable to keep up with whether or not their children was actually doing the lessons that were being presented. And then they didn't understand how the children were supposed to get the completed lessons back to the school.
Right.
So there was all these dynamics that they just didn't understand because they did not understand the technology. They didn't understand the devices that the school had given the children, because in Boston Public Schools, the schools actually gave the children Chromebooks. And so a lot of parents did not understand it. Here in Boston, we went through the space where people did not have the internet. And so now that was another challenge for them. And now that they have this equipment in their home, they still didn't understand how to utilize it. And so it just became this community kind of talk base. And, through Zoom, we were able to reach out to different people, because even though they didn't know technology, they were able to connect to the internet through their cell phones. And so through the cell phones, through text messaging, you're able to give them the information now to help them to download the app, the Zoom app, and now they're able to get on to Zoom. So now you've introduced them to an area that, again, unfamiliar to them. And now you're able to help them walk through from their home. You're able to look at the devices they're using and all of that good stuff. And so all of that was just through word of mouth and just speaking with people.
Mm-hmm. So, in my world, I call that qualitative data collection. And, I think sometimes people minimize that kind of work, where maybe it's less structured or it's not generating numbers. But what you actually did there is a very thorough qualitative research study, where you interviewed a variety of stakeholders and understood some core issues, and then designed some very clever interventions to get them from where they were to where they needed to be.
Peta, it's interesting that you just brought that up, because I think Renee's example is a perfect example of using data, using feedback to inform your programming and also to inform your fundraising and resource needs. But in federal grants, I can't tell you, I would say almost every federal grant application asks for qualitative versus quantitative data. And if you cannot define the distinction between the two and define what that means for your organization, then it can hurt your application. So that's a terrific example. And thank you for clarifying that as well, Peta, because that's very, very helpful information when you're approaching federal funders.
Yeah, and I think, people shouldn't minimize their own research efforts, right? Don't, people will say, oh, that was just anecdotal or whatever. There's no such thing as anecdotal evidence. That's just qualitative research with a small sample, right?
I love that. So, Rebecca, so the topic of our show is using data for fundraising or data-informed fundraising. So obviously, Renee is on the show because she has followed that protocol and has had some success. Rebecca, as our fundraising guru, tell us a little bit about how organizations can, during this time, can do this work, and how do we know what kind of grants we're better suited for, and all those good things that EDs are struggling with these days?
Sure. No, that's a great question, Cynthia. I'm glad that you brought it up. So with fundraising and grant writing and fund development, you always want to have conversations with your donors and stakeholders and ask them what makes them give. So we have data there of self-report of what makes them give, why they are involved and engaged in our organization, but also what is it that we can share with them with respect to data that they want to know in terms of outcomes of, okay, we've made this donation, and now tell us not just what you did with it about your program, but what were some of those outcomes, favorable or otherwise, that were a direct result of the support and resources that funders invested in your organization for. We also use data of our program attendance, all of the things that Renee has just done a great job summarizing in terms of she recognized the barriers or challenges among her participants and the clients that she served. And so she pivoted or made accommodations to serve them. And with those accommodations or changes, also came changes in the program delivery, which may then have resulted in a change in the funding that you go after. So for example, operation expenses or the use of space, those operation expenses tend to be more difficult to secure funding at the private foundation level. You might look for a state or federal grant for that. In terms of the use of space, you might partner with a collaborator who you actually don't have to apply for funds for because the partner is offering the space. But if you had to purchase space, entirely, then you would use what is going on in real time to inform your fundraising and grant writing efforts to then approach funders and have conversations with them based on what their areas of priority are to fund. So if they tell you they don't fund operations or buildings or infrastructure, then you probably wouldn't approach that funder for those needs. You would approach one who describes what they fund, because all funders are going to tell you exactly what they'll fund. And then you say, okay, if that's their priority, and this is what our community is calling for, and this is what we know that we need, you sort of line all three of those themes up together, and that's how you find that right fit funding.
I see. And and we have a comment that I want to address, but before we move there, I want to ask you, when a nonprofit is starting out, right? And so they may or may not have data. What's a way to get in to begin to receive funding, and how much funding should they think they will be getting in the beginning so that they can set up their expectations?
You don't want to just find a grant for $50,000 because it's available to you. Chances are, as a newer organization, you won't receive that grant anyway because you don't have a portfolio or a record of success. So remember, all funders are making an investment in your mission based upon your credibility, your reputation, and your ability to carry those funds out to meet the expectations that you describe in your in your grant proposal to the funder. So what I always recommend is if an organization is just starting out, hopefully you have some bylaws in place, you have your articles of incorporation, you have a strategic direction that your organization is going toward, almost like a business plan that you'd like to follow to figure out a budget for your organization and what makes sense. You don't want it to be a lot of administrative costs because those, again, are difficult to fund. And what you would like to try to do is try to promote as much direct donation or private fundraising as you are able, just to kind of build up your budget and get yourself started, so that when you do approach funders for grants, you want to start out a little slower, a little smaller, and then build your portfolio up. Because it's detrimental to organizations that if I just started out, let's say 2 years ago, and I secured a $50,000 grant, that would be awesome, right? That would be everyone's dream to do as a newer organization. However, the next year, I have to start out at a budget of $50,000. And if I go below that, then when a funder requests your financials, you're going to be up here this year. And next year, if you don't raise that, let's say you raise 15, your financials are going to take a dip. And it looks like you either did something wrong or you lost revenue. And that's not a good position for an applicant to be in. So being mindful of responsible fundraising and discussing all that with your board and with your staff, your administrators, and also your community to find out what it is that they need so you can deliver those resources. It goes back to conversation.
Yeah. Renee, does this resonate with you?
Absolutely, because of the fact that we are a new organization and new nonprofit, and a lot of the things, and we're learning. And so a lot of things we're reading, we're learning, thank goodness we're working with Rebecca, so we're definitely educating ourselves on what to do, what not to do. And all of that is very clear and very important. And so that's why it's important for us to just stay focused on our mission and what we intend to do with the community, and not so much focus on the money. We need to leave the money to somebody else. Mm-hmm. And so with that, we're able to show what we're doing and what have you, and hopefully we get to that point where we are $1 million nonprofit organization.
That's awesome. I want to bring in a comment that we got a while ago. I'm going to bring it up. Renee, it may cut you a little bit on the bottom, but we're just going to keep it up for a minute. So we got a message from May where she says, my team and I were just talking about that in New York. So she's from New York City. We had to not only teach the students, but the parents as well. She's talking about technology. Challenging process, but it can be done. And then I asked her, well, tell us, how did you learn that this was an issue, right? So this is what Peter keeps telling us, is using our data to inform our practice. So Myra and her team noticed that there's a need. How did she figure this out? And so her response was, well, we had to make sure that all of the students got their technology, and then we had sessions for the parents and had to teach them how to log in and etc. And then they found that different carriers offered internet for free for 90 days. So all this, she says, was a team effort from her team. So again, her effectiveness as she works in New York City schools was done because they brought the parents together to show them the technology, and then learn that there needed to be a deeper learning on that end, much like what Renee was finding out.
But an interesting example of partnering with the internet carriers.
Yeah.
And, it sounds like they were leveraging an existing program, but how could you take potentially that relationship and say, this has been so great, and, look at how you're contributing and extend that relationship. That might be a really good start to start collecting some funding or in-kind resources, right?
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about you, Peter, is this idea that everything is data, right? That if you are gathering information, look at it as data collection, summarize it, sit back with it, think about it, and write a summary, because one day that paragraph might get included into a grant report.
I mean, at a minimum, it goes into a grant report,
Yeah.
right? I think one of the things that we're learning from Rebecca is the funders want to see how you're learning and growing.
Yes.
So you collect some data and then you reflect on it and then you change your program like Renee has done, right? She did some qualitative research. She identified this need with the families and the households, came up with a creative way to address it. She needs to document all of that because it demonstrates that the organization is a learning organization that's responsive to community, right? And at some point, my vision is that all mission-based organizations have these incredible, rich learning journals that they can flip back through all their prior decisions and say, this is what was going on. This is why we're doing this thing. We might want to change it now, right? But we can document our intellectual progress.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And how interesting would that be to read that back and have case studies in there? I imagine that resource won't just be helpful for the operations and all that we're talking about, but also training to inform staff, to inform the community about what you're doing, and case study for scenarios. Because one thing funders really appreciate is, tell me a story about your organization and its effectiveness. Don't just tell me about what the staff are doing. Tell me how you impacted the community. That would be really interesting, Peta.
Yeah. Someday.
Cynthia, in your experience consulting with nonprofit leaders, how important is it for leaders to take an active role in supporting the design of that fundraising strategy?
Yeah, well, we're running out of time, so I'll be quick on that one. And I love the question. So depending on the size of the organization, I've seen it a couple of ways. In bigger, larger organizations, there can be a fund development team that has the expertise, experience, and really understands the science of fund development, and they can lead the strategy and maybe even write it, but it needs to have input from the ED or the CEO, and that person really needs to embrace it and learn how to speak to it, as well as track the data and track that the strategy is working. In smaller organizations, I find that oftentimes the ED or the CEO writes it and might even execute it, or maybe they write it and the team executes it. But in any event, the executive director should be very clear on what the fund development strategy is. One, to avoid mission creep. Two, ensure that the outcomes are happening, and make sure that the resources are being allocated. And by resources, I also mean staff energy are being allocated to the right program, and it's not being, watering down the other core programs or pulling resources from them. So very important, Rebecca, for the ED to know what's happening to that end.
That's great. Thank you, Cynthia. Now, Renee, thank you so much for joining us today. You've been with us since the very beginning, so you probably know that. I know, Peta, I like your clapping. Let's just. Yeah. As you know, we end every show with a key takeaway. Renee, what's your key takeaway from today's show?
My key takeaway is the importance of data. And I didn't realize that inadvertently I have been gathering data just by what I was doing, and the importance of recording it, because you never realize when you're going to utilize it or need it in the near future. So my takeaway is I definitely need to start jotting down things, whether or not I feel it's important or not.
That's right. That is a great practice. Yeah.
Peta, what's your takeaway?
My takeaway is understanding how organizations grow through different fundraising stages, right? And understanding, starting with individual donations and then moving into larger and more sophisticated grants. Makes a lot of sense.
I like that. Cynthia, what about your takeaway?
Well, when I come on this show, I always learn so much from you and Peta. This idea that if the funder does not fund what you need it to fund, to continue looking for a funder who does, and not spend too much time wasting your energy, but use that energy to arrive at your destination. And then I loved what Peter said today about there's no such thing as anecdotal data. It is qualitative data with a small sample. I'm gonna put that on my wall. Right here. But it's true, right? And so this is what Renee was saying, is that data is data. If you're talking to 5 people, you have a sample of 5. Write it down, summarize it, synthesize it, because you will need those data. And it puts you so far ahead with funders. Funders love when you can give them data along with stories, but they also love when you can give them data. It makes you sophisticated. So that's my takeaway.
Excellent. My takeaway is don't be afraid of your data. Oftentimes when I work with clients and my students, they say, I don't have data. We talked a lot last episode about it's right there in front of you, and we touched on it today as well. And Renee gave a great example, but don't be afraid of your data and be transparent about it and give true data. As you're saying, Cynthia, if you serve 5 people, don't say we serve around 5 people. Say we serve 5 people and this is how we serve them. Be proud of your data and confident in it. Don't be afraid of it. Renee, on behalf of all of us at Coffee Time with Masterminds, I can't thank you enough for joining us today, for your time, and for being such a loyal viewer and a great participant. It's been a terrific show. So please come back and visit us again.
Thanks so much for coming on.
Renee,
Thank
don't
you.
be